In a courtroom filled with tension, a black woman takes her seat behind the bench, ready to preside over the day's cases. Little does she know, a cop in the room is about to make a huge mistake. He mocks her presence, underestimating her, and questions her authority, thinking she's just another person who doesn't belong. But what happens next will shock you. The woman isn't just any ordinary person in the courtroom. She's the presiding judge. Stay tuned to see how karma strikes and the power dynamic shifts in an unforgettable moment. The courtroom was quiet except for the soft rustle of papers and the shuffle of people in their seats. The judge took her place behind the bench, her eyes scanning the room with the authority she had earned through years of hard work. Today, however, a challenge was waiting for her, and it came from an unlikely source. A police officer seated in the back, impatiently tapping his foot. The cop had already been in the courtroom a few times today, but today felt different. He had been watching the woman with a particular gaze, one that spoke volumes. His eyes lingered over her when she walked in, and he mumbled to a colleague sitting next to him, barely hiding the sneer that tugged at the corner of his mouth. To him, it was clear. A woman like her, especially one of her race, couldn't possibly belong in this position. He had no idea who she was, but to him, she was just another figure in a place that wasn't meant for people like her. As the judge called the next case, he leaned forward in his chair. He couldn't help himself. His voice, loud enough to carry, broke the silence in the room. "Is this really who's in charge of the courtroom?" he said, smirking, clearly trying to provoke her. The question was laced with mockery, his tone dripping with disrespect. "Are we sure she knows what she's doing?" The judge paused, her eyes narrowing, but her face remained calm. She had encountered prejudice before, but this time it was more brazen than usual. The courtroom's energy shifted as the officer's words echoed. The tension was palpable, and the rest of the room seemed to hold its breath, unsure of how the judge would respond. The judge, without missing a beat, calmly addressed the officer's comment, her voice firm but unshaken. "Excuse me, officer," she said, her tone cold, "but you're mistaken. I am the presiding judge in this courtroom, and I expect to be treated with the respect that the position demands." The room fell silent as the judge's words hung in the air, but the cop didn't seem to get the message. His eyes narrowed, and instead of backing down, he leaned forward in his seat, still trying to provoke her. The arrogance on his face was clear. He couldn't believe a woman, especially a black woman, could hold such a position. He scoffed under his breath and muttered something that the judge, though calm, could hear clearly. "You're just playing the part," he sneered, as though mocking her position wasn't enough. A judge should know better than to let things like this slide. His voice wasn't quiet. It was a direct challenge, an attempt to assert dominance over her in her own courtroom. His contempt for her was undeniable, and the other people in the room could feel the rising tension. They watched as the judge remained composed, keeping her face neutral despite the venom in his words, the woman's gaze fixed on the officer, the challenge clear in her eyes. This wasn't just about him questioning her authority. It was about the underlying assumption that she didn't belong there. It was the kind of disrespect she had faced her whole life. But now, in this moment, she had the power to put him in his place. Without showing even a hint of agitation, she spoke, her voice cold but firm. "Officer, I don't take kindly to being disrespected, especially in my own courtroom." She paused for effect, letting the weight of her words sink in. "If you have a problem with my authority, I suggest you take it up with the higher courts. But in here, you will show the respect that I've earned, or you will find yourself on the other side of the bench." The officer's face flushed with anger, But he didn't retreat. Instead, he stood up, his voice rising. "This is ridiculous. You don't belong here. You don't have the experience, the credentials." Before he could finish, the judge interrupted him, her tone unwavering. "I've earned this position through dedication, education, and hard work. And you are undermining not just me, but the integrity of this courtroom." She turned to the other people present, her eyes sweeping across the room, as if she were silently asking for support, showing that she would not be intimidated. Her words were a quiet but forceful reminder that this space, this courtroom, belonged to her just as much as it did anyone else. The officer had crossed a line, but the judge wasn't backing down. The cop's aggression only intensified, his face reddening with frustration. "I don't care who you are," he snapped, taking a step closer to the bench. "You shouldn't be here. You're not qualified. You will sit down, officer." The judge cut him off sharply, her voice now louder, more commanding. "If you wish to speak, you will do so respectfully, or you will be removed." The officer was taken aback by her directness. The other people in the room, who had been watching the exchange in stunned silence, began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Some of them whispered, others exchanged uneasy glances, but all were watching with bated breath. They had never seen such a public confrontation in this space before. It wasn't just about the officer's challenge to the woman. It was a moment that threatened to expose how deep the biases ran in places like this. The woman, however, remained unflinching. She knew the stakes. She had faced discrimination before, had been overlooked and underestimated her whole life. But now, in this very courtroom, she had the power to shut down these outdated prejudices and take control of the situation. The officer, now realizing he was losing the battle, stepped back. His fists clenched in frustration, but he was silent. The judge's unwavering confidence had effectively put him in his place. "You have no authority here to act like this," she added, her voice softening but still filled with conviction. "Your behavior is unprofessional and unacceptable in my court. Now, I suggest you sit down, or I will have you removed for contempt." For a moment, there was an eerie silence, as if everyone was waiting for the officer to either back down or escalate the situation further. His eyes met hers, and in that moment, he realized there was no room for his intimidation tactics. The woman had won the silent battle for power in the room. He could either comply, or he would lose whatever influence he had left. With a final, frustrated glance at the judge, the officer grumbled and reluctantly returned to his seat. The tension that had been thick in the room slowly began to dissipate as the focus returned to the proceedings. The officer slumped back into his seat, clearly frustrated, but the damage had already been done. The room buzzed with nervous energy as people exchanged glances. It was rare to see such a blatant challenge to authority in a courtroom, and rarer still for the judge to hold her ground so firmly. The woman remained composed, her focus back on the case at hand, but she could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her. She had done more than just command respect. She had shown them all what true authority looked like. The officer, now simmering with anger, muttered something under his breath, but the judge didn't flinch. She wasn't just a figurehead in the courtroom. She was the one who held the power, and she had made it clear that no one would be allowed to undermine her. She called the next case, maintaining her professionalism, while the officer seethed silently in the back. As the proceedings continued, the tension between them never fully dissipated. The officer's earlier insults had left their mark, and he was now looking for any reason to retaliate, any opportunity to reassert his dominance. The woman knew that he was seething under the surface, but she didn't let that distract her. She was the judge here, and she would continue to uphold the law, no matter how many attempts were made to derail her. After a few more cases, it was clear that the officer wasn't going to let things slide. He interrupted again, this time louder, trying to push her buttons. "This is a joke," he shouted, standing up abruptly. "You're out of your league. You're a disgrace to this courtroom." The room fell silent, and for a moment, the judge simply stared at him. This wasn't just a personal attack on her. It was a direct insult to the justice system, to everything she had worked for. This was no longer just about her. This was about standing up for the integrity of the court and the legal system. Without missing a beat, the woman stood up from behind the bench. Her eyes locked onto the officers. The room held its breath, waiting for what would happen next. The woman's presence was powerful, and for the first time the officer hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. "You think I'm a disgrace?" she said, her voice calm but firm, like a blade cutting through the tension in the room. "Let me remind you that I've worked harder than you can imagine to get to this point. I've earned my place here. I've fought for the right to sit in this chair, and I will not let anyone, least of all you, disrespect me in my courtroom." Her words rang out clearly, and the officer's arrogance faltered. The room, which had been holding its breath, seemed to exhale in unison, and for the first time, the officer looked around the courtroom, realizing the full weight of what was happening. He was no longer the center of attention. The power had shifted, and the judge had taken back control of the room with nothing more than her words and the force of her presence. "Now," she continued, her eyes narrowing as she addressed the officer with finality, "if you have something to say, you'll address me respectfully. Otherwise, I'll have you removed from this courtroom, and I won't hesitate to do so." The officer swallowed, his confidence having evaporated. He had pushed too far, and now he was in danger of losing everything: his credibility, his position, and his reputation. His mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time in this entire interaction, he found himself speechless. The woman didn't wait for him to respond. She turned her attention back to the court, her calm authority once again guiding the proceedings. "Let's continue," she said, her voice unwavering. "Next case." The officer sat down, defeated, his face red with embarrassment. He knew that his actions had crossed a line, and now he was forced to live with the consequences. The judge had not only outsmarted him in the moment, but she had also shown the entire courtroom the true meaning of authority. For the rest of the session, the officer remained silent, his frustration evident but contained. He no longer dared to challenge the woman who sat at the bench. The judge, however, continued to preside over the cases with the same professionalism and dignity that she had shown from the very beginning. It was clear to everyone in the room that this was her courtroom, and no one was above the law, not even a police officer. The tension in the courtroom lingered as the officer sat back in his seat, now visibly subdued. The judge, still calm, continued to preside over the cases, effortlessly navigating the courtroom with authority. The man who had once sought to assert his dominance now had nothing but a quiet, begrudging silence to offer. His earlier bravado had been shattered by a woman who had shown him the very power of quiet confidence and professionalism. But the story didn't end there. Just as the day was winding down, and the officer thought he might slip out unnoticed, a quiet murmur rippled through the courtroom. The woman, who had not once shown the slightest hint of struggle during the session, stood up once more, her voice cutting through the soft noise. "Before we conclude today's session, there is something important I need to address," she said. her tone sharp, but with a sense of controlled calm. "Officer, I hope you're paying attention, because this is for you." The room went silent again, the shift in energy palpable. Everyone knew this was not a simple conclusion to the day's proceedings. It was something deeper, something more significant. The officer, sitting with his arms crossed, looked up, his expression still angry, but now with a hint of confusion. What could she possibly have to say to him after everything that had just transpired? He had assumed that she would move on, that the embarrassment was over. But it wasn't. The woman took a breath and spoke again, her words slow, deliberate. "You came into my courtroom today, assuming you could disrespect me without consequence. You assumed that because of my appearance, because of who you think I am, that I wouldn't be able to stand up for myself." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over him and over everyone else in the room. "But you underestimated me. You underestimated the power of professionalism, the power of respect, and the strength of someone who knows exactly who they are." She glanced briefly at the audience, who had been watching the entire exchange, and then back at the officer. "I want you to understand something," she continued. "What you saw today was not just a woman in charge of a courtroom. It was the result of years of hard work, countless sacrifices, and the determination to break barriers that were never meant to be broken. And I'll tell you this, there's nothing more dangerous than a person who's been underestimated, a person who knows their worth and refuses to back down." The room was still, every person now fully aware of the weight of her words. The officer, who had spent the entire day trying to belittle her, was now facing the undeniable truth. She wasn't just a judge. She was a living testament to overcoming adversity, and her strength was undeniable. But then came the twist, the revelation that would hit him harder than any reprimand or confrontation could. "I'm sure you were wondering about my qualifications, my experience," she said, her voice softening just slightly. "Well, I'll tell you this. I didn't just become a judge because of my degree. I became a judge because I'm the best at what I do. And I'm well aware that you, officer, have not done your homework. You have no idea who I am outside of this courtroom." The officer shifted in his seat, his face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and confusion. What could she be talking about? He had assumed she was just another black woman, working a job she didn't deserve. But now, his assumptions were unraveling before him. With a calm but steady gaze, she continued, "I didn't just earn my degree and rise through the ranks. I'm not just a judge. I'm also an advocate for civil rights. I've fought for reform in the very system you represent. I've been on the front lines of policy changes. And if you knew who I was outside of this courtroom, you would understand why you don't want to test me again." The officer, now speechless, finally understood. The woman sitting before him wasn't just a black woman he had mistaken for someone unqualified. She was a force to be reckoned with. His earlier actions were not just disrespectful. They were a clear violation of everything that the justice system stood for. She had shown him up in the most profound way, and now he knew exactly who he was dealing with. The entire room sat in stunned silence. The judge had revealed her true identity, not to boast, but to make a point, that her position was earned, that her power was real, and that no one, especially not someone who underestimated her based on race and gender, could take that away. And just like that, the officer's arrogance crumbled. The power dynamic had shifted entirely. He had tried to push her, belittle her, and undermine her authority. But in the end, she had turned the tables, not with anger, but with quiet confidence, intellect, and the truth. The room remained still as the weight of the judge's words settled over everyone. The officer, who had once felt so certain of his superiority, now sat quietly, his face flushed with embarrassment. His previous confidence had evaporated, replaced by a deep, humbling realization. The judge had not only outsmarted him, but she had exposed his ignorance and assumptions in front of the entire room. His earlier attempt to diminish her authority had completely backfired. For a few moments, there was only the sound of the judge's voice as she continued the proceedings, now with a calm air of finality. "We will continue with the case," she said firmly, her eyes briefly meeting those of the officer before returning to the court. "And I expect full cooperation from all present. Any further disruptions will not be tolerated." The officer, now silenced, had no choice but to comply. He had expected the judge to back down, to apologize for standing her ground. Instead, she had proven not only her competence, but also the power of dignity, resilience, and professionalism in the face of adversity. The officer's earlier attempts at harassment were no longer the focal point of the room. The judge had reasserted control, and in doing so, she had demonstrated exactly why she deserved her place on the bench. The rest of the proceedings continued without incident, but the room's atmosphere had shifted. No one could ignore the lesson that had just unfolded. The cop, once confident in his ability to dominate, now understood the importance of respect, not just for others, but for the position and authority of the person in front of him. His mistaken belief that he could mock the judge's role had revealed a deeper issue, a lack of understanding, a deep-seated prejudice, and an unspoken assumption that someone like her couldn't possibly belong in such a position of power. After the session concluded, the officer left the courtroom, his shoulders slumped. He had come in that day with arrogance, expecting to challenge the authority of a black woman, thinking she wouldn't have the same legal experience or qualifications he had seen in his colleagues. But he had underestimated her, and in doing so, had exposed his own biases. It was a humbling moment, one he wouldn't easily forget. The judge, however, didn't let the incident weigh on her. As the courtroom emptied, she stood at her bench, taking a deep breath. She knew she had won, not just for herself, but for all those who had ever been doubted, dismissed, or judged based on assumptions rather than merit. The officer's actions had provided her with the opportunity to stand firm, to show him, and everyone in the room, exactly who she was. She understood that the moment was not just about winning an argument. It was about confronting deep-rooted biases that still affected the system, the justice system that she was a part of. It was about showing that power doesn't always come from status, but from knowledge, hard work, and the unwavering belief in one's worth. In the days that followed, the incident became a topic of conversation throughout the community. People who had been quietly following the trial or working in the courthouse began to reflect on the prejudices they themselves had unknowingly accepted. It wasn't just the officer's mistake. It was a wake-up call for many. The judge's ability to maintain her composure and authority in the face of such disrespect had inspired others to rethink how they treated people in positions of power, and how easily assumptions could cloud one's judgment. The officer, too, had learned a valuable lesson. His actions were not without consequence. The department received complaints, and internal reviews were conducted to ensure that such an event wouldn't be repeated. Though he was not immediately fired, his behavior was documented and he faced disciplinary action. More importantly, the incident opened up a conversation within the department about respect, authority, and the biases that were often left unchecked. It was clear that the officer's behavior was a symptom of a larger issue, one that needed to be addressed if real change was going to happen. For the judge, this moment was not just a personal triumph. It was a reminder that respect must be earned, and that those who hold power must be held to a higher standard. She had faced down discrimination and bias not with anger, but with intelligence, professionalism, and grace. She had shown the officer and everyone in the courtroom that authority is not about appearance or assumptions. It is about competence, fairness, and the ability to stand firm in one's beliefs. This experience would not be her last test, but she knew that it would stay with her as a reminder of the importance of pushing through the barriers that society often places in front of marginalized people. She wasn't just a judge. She was an example of resilience and strength in the face of adversity. In the end, the story wasn't just about one woman proving her worth. It was about everyone in that courtroom learning the value of respect, equality, and standing up against prejudice. The officer had been exposed for his ignorance, but the judge had become the true symbol of strength and justice. She had earned her place, and no amount of bias or disrespect could ever take that away from her. The judge's powerful stand that day didn't just change the course of one courtroom session. It had a lasting impact that rippled through the entire justice system. Her calm confidence, unshaken by the cops' disrespect, had proven that respect is earned through hard work, integrity, and perseverance, not through the color of one's skin or gender. Her unwavering commitment to fairness served as a lesson for everyone in the room that day, reminding them that true authority doesn't come from titles alone. It comes from the respect you command through your actions and knowledge. What's your take on the events that unfolded? Have you ever had to stand up against unfair treatment or been underestimated because of your background? How did you handle the situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your stories. If this story inspired you, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more empowering stories about resilience, justice, and standing up against discrimination. Every voice matters, and together we can continue fighting for equality and fairness in every aspect of life. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video where we bring more stories of strength and justice to light.